February 4th, 1944. The Nazis were building a bomb that could end the war in a single afternoon. Not a bigger bomb, not a better bomb. A weapon so catastrophic that a single one dropped on London could kill every person in the city before anyone heard the explosion. The scientists working on it called it a theoretical possibility. The men funding it called it a theoretical possibility. And deep inside an occupied mountain valley in Silesia, behind barbed wire, guard towers, and 2 companies of Wehrmacht soldiers, a factory was producing the one ingredient they could not build it without. 3 Allied teams had already tried to stop it. 3 teams had gone in. None had come out. London had run the numbers. The analysts, the generals, the men who decided which lives were worth spending, they all arrived at the same conclusion. The facility was too well defended. The risk was too high. The mission was impossible. And then a quiet, unremarkable engineer from a border town nobody had ever heard of looked at those same numbers, made a cup of black coffee, and said he would do it alone. Deep inside a mountain valley shrouded by pine forests and winter fog, a factory hummed with a purpose that most of the world did not yet understand. Behind 3 rings of barbed wire, 2 Wehrmacht infantry companies, roving Gestapo patrols, and guard towers fitted with searchlights that swept the snow-covered ground every 45 seconds. The Wolfsberg Industrial Research Institute produced one thing in extraordinary quantities: heavy water. It sounded almost poetic, but in the winter of 1944, it was the most dangerous substance on the planet. Without it, the Nazi atomic bomb program could not advance. Without it, the scientists in Berlin had no way to sustain a nuclear chain reaction. Without it, the unthinkable remained merely theoretical. Allied intelligence had known about Wolfsberg for 6 months. 3 separate operations to destroy it had been proposed and abandoned. 2 RAF bombing raids had failed to penetrate the mountain cloud cover. A special forces team had been parachuted in 3 weeks earlier. None of them had come back. The men in London who planned such things looked at the maps, looked at the casualty reports, and shook their heads. Nobody believed it could be done. Before we dive in, I want to know, where are you listening to this story from? Drop your city or country in the comments right now, and let's see which corner of the world has the most War Legend fans. Don't just scroll, type it out. Your comment might get featured in the next story. His name was Karl Wendt. He was 31 years old, 5 feet 9 inches tall, and he had a habit of tapping his right thumb against the side of his knee when he was thinking hard. His colleagues at the chemical engineering firm where he had worked before the war remembered him as quiet, methodical, a man who preferred blueprints to conversation and a cup of black coffee to almost any other pleasure. His supervisor had once described him in a performance review as precise to the point of stubbornness. It was not intended as a compliment. Karl had taken it as one. He had been born in Gliwice, a town on the German-Polish border in Silesia, in 1912. His father was German, a foreman at a steelworks. His mother was Polish, the daughter of a schoolteacher from Krakow. Karl grew up between 2 worlds, speaking both languages without accent, understanding both cultures from the inside. He knew how to think like a German engineer, methodical, hierarchical, deferential to systems and procedures. He also knew how to think like a Pole, stubborn beneath his surface of compliance, patient in the face of oppression, quietly furious when it mattered most. In 1939, when German tanks rolled into Poland, Karl had been in Warsaw on a consulting contract for an industrial heating company. He watched the city burn from the window of a 4th-floor apartment. He helped pull a family out of a collapsed building during the bombardment and carried a child, a girl of perhaps 4 years old, 6 blocks to a hospital that was itself on fire. The child had lived, the hospital had not. He made his way west afterward, returned to Gliwice, and tried to disappear into ordinary professional life. He took work wherever the Reich's industrial apparatus offered it. He designed ventilation systems. He inspected pressure valves. He drew no attention to himself, but he had not forgotten Warsaw. In the spring of 1942, a man he had known slightly before the war, an old university contact named Brandt, who had eyes that never quite smiled even when his mouth did, sat down across from Karl at a cafe in Breslau and asked him, very quietly, how he felt about his work. Karl had looked out the window for a long moment. "I feel nothing about my work," he said. "That is the problem." Brandt slid a piece of paper across the table with an address on it. 3 days later, Carl met a British Special Operations executive courier in the back room of a bicycle repair shop. Within a month, he was trained in coded communication, dead letter drops, and the use of small explosive charges. Within 6 months, he was one of the most valued technical intelligence assets the SOE had in German-occupied Central Europe. He was not brave in the way that stories usually describe bravery. He did not charge forward. He did not make speeches. He was brave in the quieter, more durable way. The way that gets up in the morning, knowing exactly what it is walking into, makes a cup of coffee, taps its thumb against its knee, and goes anyway. When London sent word in January 1944 that Wolfsberg needed to be destroyed, and that they needed a man who understood industrial chemical processes, who spoke fluent German and who could pass as a civilian worker without raising suspicion, there was really only one name on the list. Carl went, read the mission brief twice, folded the paper, and burned it in the ashtray on his kitchen table. Then he sat in the dark for a while, tapping his thumb against his knee. Then he said, to no one in particular, all right. He had 3 weeks, which was not enough, and which would have to be enough. The first thing Carl did was not to look at the target. It was to look at everything around the target. A fortress is defined as much by its surroundings as by its walls, and the men who had failed before him had focused too hard on the walls. Through his SOE contact network, he obtained 2 pieces of information that nobody in London had thought to combine. The first was a supply manifest, a mundane document listing industrial deliveries scheduled for the Wolfsberg facility in February. The manifest noted a scheduled shipment of sulfuric acid reagents, arriving by freight truck from Breslau on the night of February 7th. The second was a report from a local Polish resistance contact, a railway worker named Tomas who had worked the Waldenburg freight line for 11 years. Tomas had observed that the facility received all major deliveries at night, because its loading dock sat on the western side of the building where a hillside completely blocked the view from the nearest village. Night deliveries. A loading dock hidden from civilian eyes. A routine that repeated itself like clockwork, every week, because routine was the thing that large bureaucratic operations trusted above all else. Night deliveries. A western loading dock hidden from civilian view. Sulfuric acid in heavy industrial quantities. Carl sat with this for 2 days. He drew maps. He crossed things out. He drew more maps. On the 3rd day, he visited a mining supply company in Breslau under the cover identity he had maintained for 18 months, that of a freelance industrial inspector named Werner Haas, contracted by various Reich-approved engineering firms. He purchased, through careful acquisition spread across 3 separate suppliers, to avoid triggering any single suspicious transaction, the components he would need. Timing detonators. Commercial blasting caps of the type used in coal mine excavations, waterproof cellophane wrapping used in food processing, and 12 kilograms of a commercially available potassium chlorate compound sold as an agricultural oxidizer, which, when combined with the right accelerant, would produce a fire that no standard extinguisher could put out. He also purchased, from a second-hand clothing dealer, a set of civilian work overalls in the dark blue favored by Sizean industrial laborers, a canvas tool belt, and a foreman's clipboard with a spring-loaded metal clasp. The clipboard was important. A man walking into a secure facility without a clipboard looked like an intruder. A man walking in with a clipboard looks like a man with a job to do and nowhere near enough time to do it. Carl had observed this principle across dozens of industrial sites in 6 years of engineering work, and it had never once failed him. Now he needed to get inside. The supply manifests told him that deliveries were processed by a small civilian staff, contract workers from Waldenburg town, who operated the loading dock under Wehrmacht supervision. The soldiers checked credentials at the outer gate. The civilian staff did the actual unloading and paperwork. There was a gap there, a seam between 2 systems, military and civilian. The soldiers trusted the civilian foreman to verify the workers. The civilian foreman trusted the soldiers to have already vetted everyone at the gate. Neither system was wrong, exactly, but between them was a space precisely the size of one man. Through Tomas, Carl learned the name of the civilian loading dock foreman, a man called Huber, 47, a former brewery worker who drank moderately and worried constantly, and hated his job with a passionate resignation that was almost artistic. Tomas had worked alongside Huber on 3 separate deliveries and had noticed something useful. Huber had a habit of arriving at the facility gate approximately 12 minutes after the delivery trucks arrived. because he lived 20 minutes away by bicycle and consistently left the house 8 minutes late. It was not laziness. It was simply the private arithmetic of a man who had been doing the same job for 2 years and had established, without ever consciously deciding to, exactly how late he could be without anyone saying anything about it. 12 minutes. Carl studied the guard tower searchlight intervals from Tomas's observations. 45 seconds east, 45 seconds west, with a 3-second dead zone on the northwestern corner between sweeps. He studied the internal layout of the facility, reconstructed painstakingly from the memories of 2 Polish workers who had briefly been employed as maintenance staff before being dismissed when the facility's security protocols tightened in autumn 1943. The heavy water electrolysis hall was in the center of the complex, in a reinforced concrete building that the workers had called the Cathedral because of its high vaulted ceiling and the low, continuous hum of its machinery. The electrolysis cells were arranged in banks along both walls. The storage tanks, 9 of them, according to the workers' best recollection, stood along the northern wall, connected to the cells by a network of copper pipes and valve assemblies. The storage tanks were the target, not the machinery, not the cells. The tanks, because destroying them would not merely interrupt production, it would eliminate months of accumulated product in a single stroke. According to the SOE's scientific advisors in London, the heavy water stockpile at Wolfsberg represented the entire reserve needed for the next phase of Nazi reactor experiments. Without it, the program would not just pause, it would collapse backward by a year or more into a state of material poverty from which recovery, given the Reich's deteriorating war position in early 1944, might prove permanently impossible. Carl looked at his map one final time. He made 3 small marks with a pencil: the outer gate, the secondary checkpoint, the electrolysis hall entrance, and drew a single line connecting them. Then he packed his tool belt, put on his borrowed overalls, and walked to the railway station. The freight truck arrived at the Wolfsberg outer gate at 9:51 p.m., 3 minutes late. Carl was in the back, lying flat between 2 wooden crates of chemical reagents. His tool belt buckled, his forged delivery documentation folded in his breast pocket, his charges wrapped in waterproof cellophane and distributed between the deep cargo pockets of his overalls in careful, padded bunches that pressed against his thighs when he moved. His heart was doing something complicated in his chest that was not quite fear and not quite calm, but some third thing that had no good name, that you only encountered in very specific circumstances and that, once encountered, you never entirely forgot. The truck stopped. He heard voices, a soldier's voice, bored and irritable, asking for documentation. The driver's voice, patient and flat, producing papers. A flashlight played across the back of the truck. He saw the thin blade of yellow light slice through the gap between the crates and travel slowly across the far wall, and then moved away. The gate opened. The truck moved forward. He breathed. The loading dock was a concrete apron on the western side of the main facility building, lit by 4 hanging industrial lamps that threw yellow cones of light down onto the ground and left the peripheral edges in deep shadow. 2 soldiers stood near the building entrance, rifles slung, watching without great interest as the truck reversed into position. 3 civilian workers in blue overalls moved forward from the dock to begin unloading. Carl had approximately 8 minutes before Huber the foreman arrived. 7 now. He needed to be inside and away from the loading area before Huber got there and began comparing faces to his mental roster of familiar workers. He slipped over the tailgate in the moment that both soldiers had their attention on the driver, who was climbing down from the cab on the far side. He landed softly on the concrete, moved immediately into the shadow beside the nearest stack of unloaded crates, and pressed his back against them. One of the civilian workers glanced in his direction. Carl raised his clipboard and made a small, dismissive gesture with 2 fingers, the universal signal of a man too occupied with something important to be interrupted. The worker looked away and went back to the crates. The secondary checkpoint was a steel door set into the building's facade, monitored by a single soldier sitting in a wooden sentry booth with a list of authorized personnel pinned to a clipboard inside the window. Carl had his forged identity documentation as Werner Haas, industrial inspector, commissioned from the Breslau Regional Engineering Authority, complete with the correct Reich inspection stamps and a letter on headed notepaper that the SOE's forgery unit in Bern had produced with their characteristic, meticulous care. He walked to the checkpoint booth without hurrying. Walking without hurrying was perhaps the single hardest skill he had developed in his time working for the SOE. Every instinct in a frightened human body is to move faster. The body wants to resolve uncertainty through speed, to put distance between itself and the source of danger as quickly as possible. But speed, in a context like this, read as guilt. Steadiness read as purpose. He had trained himself over 18 months of increasingly dangerous work to let his body feel whatever it needed to feel while his legs maintained their steady, unhurried pace. It was a dissociation of a very specific kind, and it was exhausting, and it was the thing that had kept him alive. The soldier in the booth was young, perhaps 19, with a thin neck and the expression of a man who had been told his posting was temporary for 6 months. He looked at Carl's papers with the efficient incuriosity of someone who had checked 1,000 identical documents and found nothing wrong with any of them. Purpose of visit, he said, without looking up. Ventilation inspection. Electrolysis hall, main building, third section. There has been a pressure variance report. The soldier looked up. Nobody told me about a pressure variance report. Carl let a microscopic amount of impatience show on his face. Not irritation, not frustration. Just the faint, contained exhaustion of a man who has had this exact exchange with too many gatekeepers tonight and has a schedule to maintain regardless. Nobody tells you about half the reports that come through. That is precisely why they send inspectors. He tapped the documentation with one finger. The commission letter carries the authorization code. You can telephone the Breslau office to verify, but they closed 2 hours ago. The soldier looked at the commission letter. He looked at Carl. He looked at the commission letter again. He handed it back and opened the door. The interior of the Wolfsberg facility was warm after the February night outside, and the warmth hit Carl like something physical as he stepped through the door and into the corridor. He understood immediately, even from here, why the maintenance workers had called the electrolysis hall the cathedral. Even from this distance, through 2 walls of reinforced concrete, he could hear it, a deep, continuous, resonant hum, like a single organ note held without breath, vibrating at a frequency that seemed to pass through the walls and into the bones of the building itself. He moved through the corridor with his clipboard up, scanning the walls as though checking something specific. 2 technicians in white laboratory coats walked past him in the opposite direction without glancing at him. A Wehrmacht corporal stood at the far end of the corridor, smoking a cigarette with a folded newspaper under his arm. Carl turned before he reached the corporal, through a side passage he had memorized from the maintenance workers' descriptions. Left at the junction with a green pipe running along the ceiling, right at the electrical board, third door on the left, he was 40 feet from the electrolysis hall entrance when he heard it. Footsteps, fast ones, coming from behind him. He did not stop walking. He slowed by perhaps 15%, the organic deceleration of a man who suspects he may have turned one door too early and looked at his clipboard with an expression of mild calculation. The footsteps became a voice. "You there!" He turned. A Gestapo officer in a dark civilian suit and overcoat, perhaps 35 years old, dark-haired, with the flat, deliberate gaze of a man who made his living noticing things that other people walked past without seeing. A Wehrmacht soldier stood 2 paces behind him. "Your identity card," the officer said. "Not a question." Carl produced it. The forged Werner Haas identity card, excellent work by the SOE's standards, but no forgery was perfect under sustained scrutiny, and Gestapo officers were specifically trained to find the details that bored soldiers missed. "What are you doing in this section?" "Ventilation inspection. Electrolysis hall. Pressure variance report. This section requires a level 4 clearance escort." The officer handed the card back. "Who authorized you to proceed unescorted?" Carl kept his expression steady. "The duty officer at the secondary checkpoint. If there has been a procedural error, that is a matter for your office and his. I am on a repair schedule." The officer studied him. "1 second, 2, 3, 4, 5, wait here," he said. He turned to the soldier and spoke quietly, then moved back down the corridor the way he had come. He was going to make a telephone call. Carl had perhaps 4 minutes, perhaps 3. He turned and walked to the third door on the left. The electrolysis hall was everything the maintenance workers had described, and something more than they had managed to convey. It stretched perhaps 40 meters from end to end, the ceiling arching 15 meters overhead in a long concrete vault. The banks of electrolysis cells hummed their deep single note along both walls, lit in a pale blue-white glow from overhead fluorescent lighting that made everything look slightly underwater. Copper pipes ran in dense parallel lines from the cells to the northern wall, where 9 cylindrical storage tanks stood in a row, each one approximately 2 meters tall and 1 meter in diameter. connected to each other and to the main output manifold by a valve and pipe system of elegant industrial design. Two technicians were at work near the far end of the hall, their backs turned, bent over an instrument panel. Carl walked to the first storage tank without running. He reached into his left cargo pocket and removed the first charge. His hands were completely steady. He had noticed this about himself under extreme pressure before, and had never been able to fully explain it. It was not courage in any conventional sense. It was, he thought, simply the effect of a mind that had narrowed down to a single point of absolute focus, leaving no bandwidth for the peripheral tremors of fear. The fear was still there. He could feel it somewhere behind and below the focus, a cold pressure like deep water, but it had no access to his hands. He fixed the first charge to the base of the tank with its adhesive backing, ran the detonator wire to the junction point on the copper manifold, and moved to the second tank. At the fourth tank, one of the technicians at the far end of the hall straightened up and turned around. Carl was crouched at the base of the tank, partially behind it. He did not move. He stopped breathing. The technician looked in his general direction for 2 full seconds, his expression vaguely distracted in the way of a man whose mind is still on the instrument reading he has just taken. Then he scratched the back of his head and turned back to the panel. Carl breathed. He continued. 5 tanks, 6, 7, 8, 9, 9. The connection wiring took him another 2.5 minutes, running all 9 charges to a single trigger line attached to a timer detonator set for 22 minutes. Enough time, if everything proceeded as planned, to get out of the building, across the loading yard, through the fence, and into the tree line where Thomas would be waiting with a car. He stood, tucked the detonator inside his overall pocket, and walked back to the hall entrance. The Gestapo officer was standing in the corridor outside, not running, not shouting, simply standing there 10 feet away with the flat, certain expression of a man who has completed his call and received precisely the answer he expected. "Werner Haas," the officer said, "there is no ventilation inspection scheduled for tonight. There has been no pressure variance report, and the Breslau Regional Engineering Authority has no record of this commission letter." Carl looked at him. The timer was running, 20 minutes, perhaps less. He had one option remaining. He had hoped not to use it. Loud was the enemy of everything in a situation like this. But hope, as the night had apparently decided, was a luxury no longer on offer. He threw the clipboard. It was not a weapon. It was a distraction. Half a second of something unexpected arriving at a face. The aluminum clipboard with its spring-loaded metal clasp caught the Gestapo officer across the bridge of the nose with a sharp, flat crack. Not hard enough to cause serious injury. Hard enough to make a man flinch, to close his eyes for precisely 1 second out of pure reflex. Carl was already running. He went right instead of left, away from the secondary checkpoint, which would be alerted within 30 seconds, and toward the facility's maintenance exit on the eastern wall, which the workers had described as secured only by a padlock during night shift, because the guard towers provided what the security planners had apparently considered adequate coverage. He heard the officer shouting behind him. Running feet. He hit the maintenance exit at full speed, found the padlock, found the Haas plate beneath it weakened by rust at 2 of its 3 screws. He hit it with his shoulder once, hard, twice. On the third impact, the Haas gave with a sound like a rifle shot, and the door swung outward into the February night. Cold air, snow, the darkness beyond the building's light footprint, and the sweep of a searchlight 40 meters to his left, moving away from him. He ran into the darkness between the searchlight's current position and where it would be in 45 seconds. The perimeter fence was 2 meters of chain link topped with a coil of barbed wire. He hit it without slowing, went up it in 4 hand-over-hand pulls that tore his right palm on a wire barb, and opened a cut he would not feel properly until 2 hours later. He rolled over the top with the barbed wire catching his overalls and pulling a long strip of fabric away with a sound like tearing paper, and dropped hard onto the frozen ground on the other side, landing awkwardly on his left ankle, catching himself with both hands on the snow. A shout from the tower. A shot high and wide, the crack of it splitting the winter air. He was into the tree line before the second shot. Tomas was there, exactly where he was supposed to be, sitting in a dark green Opel Kadett, with the engine already running and both hands pale on the steering wheel. Carl threw himself into the passenger seat. Tomas had the car moving before the door was fully shut. They drove in silence on a forestry road heading north, the headlights off, navigating by moonlight on snow. Carl wrapped his cut hand in the cloth from his tool belt pocket and watched the tree line on either side for the movement of following vehicles. 11 minutes later, on the forestry road, 3 kilometers from the facility, he felt the sound before he heard it. A deep, rolling concussion that traveled up through the earth, through the frozen road surface, through the car's frame and the seat and into his spine. The windows flexed. The rearview mirror trembled. Then the sky behind them turned orange. 9 storage tanks. Months of accumulated heavy water product. The entire northern wall of the electrolysis hall and substantial portions of the reinforced concrete roof. The primary blast triggered a secondary explosion in the sulfuric acid delivery, the very shipment whose manifest had given him his cover, which spread fire across the loading dock and the adjacent compressor building in a chain reaction that the facility's fire response team, undertrained and understaffed for an event of this magnitude, could not control. The Wolfsberg Industrial Research Institute burned for 16 hours. The fire was visible from the nearest village. It was visible from the Ridge Road 15 kilometers to the east. 3 people who saw it that night from separate locations later remembered thinking independently that it looked like a sunrise in the wrong direction. The confusion inside the burning facility was, according to later Allied intelligence assessments, almost total. The first problem the Wehrmacht garrison faced was not the fire. The garrison had fire response procedures. The first problem was that almost no one in the facility's immediate chain of command fully understood what was burning or why it mattered. The soldiers at the outer gate were standard infantry. They had been told that Wolfsberg was a classified industrial research installation and that their job was to keep unauthorized people out. The precise nature of the research was above their clearance level. When the fire started, 2 separate duty officers made 2 separate calls to 2 separate superior officers, neither of whom reached the correct technical authority for 45 minutes. By the time someone who understood the strategic significance of what was being consumed picked up a telephone, the storage tanks had been burning for over an hour. The Gestapo launched an investigation the following morning. They established with reasonable certainty that a saboteur had entered the facility using forged documentation during the night's scheduled delivery. They had a physical description from the officer who had been struck by the clipboard. 5'9", dark overalls, calm manner, German accent with a trace of something else, possibly regional. They had the strip of blue overall fabric caught on the perimeter fence. They had the tire tracks of an unregistered vehicle on the forestry road to the north. What they did not have was a name, a face, a confirmed identity, any reliable indication of where the man had gone or who had sent him. Karl Wendt, by the time the Gestapo assembled these fragments into a profile, was 70 kilometers north of Waldenburg, in a farmhouse outside Lignitz, sleeping on a straw mattress under 3 wool blankets with his right hand wrapped in a cloth bandage and the iodine drying brown at the edges of the cut. The strategic effects of what he had done took time to accumulate and longer still to fully understand. In Berlin, the Reich Research Council's nuclear weapons program had depended on Wolfsberg for its most critical experimental work. The heavy water stockpile destroyed on the night of February 7th represented the accumulated production of approximately 7 months of continuous operation. To rebuild that stockpile would require another 6 to 8 months of production at minimum, assuming no further disruption and assuming the facility itself could be repaired. To repair the facility required skilled construction workers, specialized equipment, and raw materials, none of which the Reich had in comfortable abundance in the early months of 1944. With the Eastern Front demanding everything and the Allies' strategic bombing campaign increasingly disrupting the industrial supply chains that underpinned every aspect of the German war economy. The program did not end on the night of February 7th. It limped forward for another year, growing slower and more desperate as circumstances contracted around it. But the Wolfsberg operation had broken something that could not be easily rebuilt. Not just equipment and stored product, but the momentum of a program that had been approaching a critical threshold. The careful, accelerating sequence of experiments that the facility had been designed to support was interrupted at its most vulnerable point, at exactly the moment when it had begun to look, to the men directing it, as though they might actually be getting somewhere. British intelligence received a decoded message in March 1944, which noted, in the measured language of institutional defeat, that the nuclear experimental program would require comprehensive restructuring of its supply and production infrastructure. An analyst in London underlined certain words and placed the document in a file marked with a classification level that almost no one in the building had clearance to read. In a different office, a senior SOE officer named Hartley, who had not slept well in 18 months, read the same report and then sat at his desk for a long while looking out the window at the gray London morning. He thought about what had been achieved and what it had cost, and about the particular sadness of victories that could never be publicly claimed, celebrated, or explained to the people who most deserved to understand them. Then he went back to work. Carl worked for the SOE through the final 16 months of the war. He was never captured. He ran 3 more operations: courier work, the verification of specific industrial intelligence, a single additional sabotage of a transformer relay station outside Oppold, and he did each of them with the same quiet, methodical precision that had defined him since his engineering days. When the war ended in May 1945, he returned to Gliwice to find that the house where he had grown up was rubble and the street itself had been renumbered. Gliwice was now Gliwice, returned to Poland, and most of its German-speaking population had fled or was leaving in the vast westward displacement that followed the Allied victory. He stayed for 2 weeks, walking the streets of his childhood with the patient expression of a man taking a final, careful measurement of something he understood he would never see again. Then he left. He settled eventually in Poznan, where his mother had relatives who had survived the war. He found work as an industrial engineer, designing heating systems for factories and apartment buildings. He had a daughter, then a son. He sat at the kitchen table in the evenings and helped them with their mathematics homework. He drank his coffee black. He grew old with the same steady quietness that had carried him through the worst years, and the thumb tapping at his knee never fully stopped. He never talked about the war, not because the memories were unbearable, though some of them were, but because he had been told not to, and because he was, above all things, a man who honored the conditions he had freely accepted. The operation at Wolfsberg had required his anonymity as part of its terms. He had given that anonymity willingly. He saw no reason to take it back. The official records of the operation were classified for decades. When the relevant files were finally released, they contained a thin folder on the Wolfsberg sabotage, a date, a casualty report showing 0 Allied deaths, an intelligence assessment of the strategic outcome, and an agent designation. No real name, no photograph, no further description beyond the physical profile assembled by the Gestapo in the days after the fire, the one that had not been enough to find him then and did not become enough afterward. History does not always remember the people who changed it. It is good at remembering battles and commanders and the great sweeping movements of armies. It is less reliable when it comes to the single man with a tool belt and a forged clipboard, standing in a concrete corridor, listening to footsteps coming toward him, doing the arithmetic one final time. The cost of the action against the cost of the action, and finding, as he had found before, and would find again, that the calculation was not complicated. But the world he helped preserve carries the evidence of what he did in every ordinary thing that followed. Every morning that arrived without catastrophe, every unremarkable cup of coffee, every child bent over mathematics homework in evening light. These things do not announce themselves as legacies. They do not need to. They are simply what remains.